Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome to the Happy Hour Live webcast from WhiskyCast.com. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio. Hope you've had a good week. We are well into the month of May right now. The Speyside Festival just finished up a few days ago, and we're getting ready for the Campbellton Malts Festival and the Isla Festival of Malt and Music coming up at the end of the month, along with a whole bunch of other things going on. Just got word that Whiskey Live USA is returning for the first time since the pandemic. It'll be in July, a 2-day event in Nashville, Tennessee. That should be a party and a half in Nashville. Lots of other things going on, and we'll be following them for you on WhiskyCast. We'll have a complete list on the calendar of events segment on the next podcast. But I want to bring in our guest right now, a name you may be familiar with by his pseudonym, the nom de guerre, the Whisky Sponge. Angus MacRaild is with us. Evening, Angus. How are you tonight?
I'm very well, thanks, Mark. How are you?
Fine. What's in your glass?
So I'm just sampling my way through a bunch of new bottlings of ours, which I'm trying for the first time. So I've got here something I've called Cream of Sponge, which is an unnamed 1993 Highland malt. And it's just nice natural cask-strength, 44.7. So easy sipping, slightly old school distillate-driven Highland whiskey. Very pleasant.
You've moved into the bottling business yourself right now. Tell us about how you made that transition.
It was not planned at all. I was getting to the point where I'd been writing this sponge blog for a number of years, and I thought it would be nice to do a bottling, or just maybe do one cask or something, just for fun to see how that would work. I hadn't done anything like that before. And it just so happened that at the same time, my friend Ian, who'd done some bottling himself under this label Copper Monument, said, "We've tried this bottling thing already, mixed results. Do you want to partner up and do something together?" And I said, sure. I was thinking about doing something for Sponge. Maybe we can make that the label. So he had a couple of nice casks, and we did those as our first two bottlings, a Glenmurray 1981 and a Hazelburn 1997, and did well. And so we just took it forward a bit from there, sourced a Clynelish 2008 for the third bottling, and then things just kind of took off a bit. And here we are less than 2 years later, and it's become a proper company, and it's all moved very quickly, and we've hired people, and it's kind of like my full-time job now, and quite terrifying how it's all taken off, but also pretty exciting. Never expected to be doing this, so I'm just enjoying this kind of new phase of my career. I've always just muddled through in whiskey and invented things as I've gone along, so who knows what I'll be doing in 10 years' time, but I didn't expect to be doing this 10 years ago, so it's kind of exciting. So yeah, enjoying it.
I have to ask, have any of the folks that you sort of poked fun at over the years as the Sponge about their whiskeys come back and given you grief about yours?
I've not had grief about the things we bottled, except I've had a few labels banned by or refused by SWA and bottling halls and things, and I've had one or two comments from people when we approached them about buying casks. We did an official Highland Park bottling for our company Decadent Drinks, because I like the idea that we source things and present them exclusively through our company. And so I wanted to do an official bottling as well as these indie ones, and I approached Highland Park because I knew and had contacts there. I knew I could get something, and someone said something in an email about, yeah, well, didn't you say this about me on the Sponge blog? And so I had to present perhaps a bit more of an argument than I would have, than other companies might necessarily have done in the same position. So, but it worked. We did it, and it was a great whiskey. So, yeah. So I think most of the time, people, most of the comments, the positive comments I've had over the years have probably been from people in the industry. I think they get that it's coming from a well-meaning place, even if sometimes it's a bit below the belt, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you've gone below the belt a few times. I won't even talk about what you called me a few times on the blog, but
you can take it, Mark. You're a big,
I can
strong
take
lad.
it. I'm a big boy. I can take it. If you put your face and name out there, you're going to get a little bit of slack or a little bit of grief every once in a while, but I can take it. But
It's always punching up. So if you, it's never intended to be cruel for the sake of it or anything. And most of the people that are getting sponged, like yourself would be in this category. It's I see it as sort of good-natured, quite Scottish piss taking. But I suppose the most brutal stuff was reserved for big companies that, I don't know, just should know better or are guilty of putting out some of the more ludicrous things in whiskey, which I think definitely deserve to be satirized. But a lot of it now, like over the years, it's changed. I don't write nearly as much as I should do or would like to, just being very busy. But the more recent stuff it's very satirical and mostly surreal. Like it's just almost like stream of conscious nonsense these days. I think it's perhaps lost some of its more ruthless streaks that it had in the early days.
But one of the things I always looked forward to every April 1st was when you got serious and wrote your commentaries about where you really think the whiskey industry is right now.
Yeah, that just happened because everyone, it was just this, there was always this established thing that everyone started doing these silly things on April 1st. And I thought, well, I can't really join in with that. And the obvious thing would be to say, guys, all this stuff is not very funny, but in a satirical way. And it just didn't seem like it worked. So I thought, well, what's the opposite? Just do a serious post. And I do like writing about whiskey more seriously. And I would say writing as a, as a practice is as much of a hobby for me as whiskey is, if not more so. And I suppose that, if I want to write things about whiskey and I want it to be meaningful and truthful and have some sort of merit or value, which is why I don't do it very often. So I usually try to wait and think of something like really, this is something I really definitely want to say. I'm clear about what it is. I know what the theme is. I know what I want to do. And so about once a year, with a few little extra bits and pieces published elsewhere occasionally is about the right rate for me, I think. And I feel that way. I'm just doing it for myself, and I don't need to, conjure up things out of thin air because an editor is asking for stuff. And I do very little paid writing work anymore because there's not much money in it, and I think it's better when you just do it from the heart for yourself.
Absolutely. I can understand that completely. And you're right, there's not much money in it, but there is a chance to speak out, and you've been able to do that with the blog. Tell me how you started the Sponge blog to begin with.
It was just because I was thinking that I should do something, strike out on my own and do something sort of that was my own voice. And I'd been doing some writing on a blog for a company that I did some work for at the time called Whisky Online. And I was writing on their blog for a while. And then I started playing around with this more sort of satirical piss-takey style. It was a bit like, there's a website in the UK called the Daily Mash, which was a sort of popularist satirical news website. And it was kind of riffing on that sort of style. And I thought there wasn't anyone really doing that in whiskey, or there hadn't been since Richard Jointson's Scotch Whisky Review, which was years before. And I thought, this is maybe a wee gap or a little niche that I could try and work something out of. And then I did a few posts on that blog, and then they said, oh, this is not really appropriate for our company. And so I thought, yeah, fair point. So I just moved it over and did this website, Whisky Sponge. And the name came from something that Serge called me when I was at his place in Alsace one year, having he has this big distillation party once a year. And we were tasting drams and wine. He poured these beautiful wines, like 1986 Haut-Brion or something like that. And then someone left half a glass and he said, right, next wine. And I said, hang on a minute, give that here. So from then on, I was known as the Sponge. I think French people thought this was hilarious that I wasn't letting spare wine off the table. Sounds bad now that I say it in retrospect, but that is the truth of the matter.
I can't argue with that point, though. I mean, no wine should go wasted. No whiskey should be wasted.
Yeah,
We
definitely
should
not
be the
nice.
ones who are wasted. I
We
should be the
nice.
ones who are wasted. I joke, of course. Spirit Bomb said she's tried some of the mini sponge bottlings at Catcher Wolf Loose. Loved all of them so far.
That's cool.
Greg Serafian in Paris has not had the chance to try any of them yet and regrets it. He keeps seeing Serge and Ruben's compliments about your bottlings, and it's frustrating as they don't make it to France and they go quickly when they do.
We can ship to France. It's just very complicated by the massive disaster that is Brexit. It's made things very difficult. So we can ship to France. It just takes quite a long time to get there. But there is a page on our website you can get information about shipping on and quotes. So just message us if you have any doubts.
What about Switzerland? Pierre Wedert is posting a comment from Switzerland asking about Switzerland.
So we can ship direct to Switzerland. We don't have an importer there yet. One of the difficulties we find with doing bottling in this day and age is that because the cost of casks goes up, so it's gone up so much in recent years. All these flash in the pan investment companies, and also just the fact that malt whiskey in general is so sort of cult and popular now as a drink. Good casks of malt whiskey are very expensive, and so supply is difficult. So prices go up, prices of bottles go up, and the margins that independent bottlers have to work with get squeezed. So we can't do this sort of pricing structure that allows us to work with importers in different markets in Europe very easily. We have some importers in Asia, which we are able to work with, which is pretty good, but we're still trying to crack the European nut. So yeah, stay tuned. But in the interim, you should be able to order most things direct from our website if you want to get any bottles that way.
And the website is decadentdrinks.com, right?
That's correct, yeah. And best thing to do if you want to find out about what we're doing is just sign up to our mailing list. And you can follow us on our social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So you can find us there, just search for Decadent Drinks if you want to follow us there. But sign up to the mailing list through the website is the best way to know about what we're doing. So, yeah.
I think you're going to be hearing from Greg soon. He was glad to hear that. Poor BMO, can of cold beer from Holland on a warm afternoon here. I understand that it's kind of muggy outside, and I'm thinking, yeah, cold beer would be good. But I never did say I've got a vintage bottle of Royal Lochnagar 12-year-old.
I like Lochnagar. I remember
Yeah.
very fondly discovering some of the early batches of the is it Select Reserve, Royal Lochnagar Select? It's weird because it's like one of the very first high-end no age statement official distillery bottlings. It's funny that they did that with Lochnagar, but you find those really early batches in the UK 75cl that are quite dark. Mwah. Incredible whiskey, so good. I haven't tried one for a long time.
Actually got this Lochnagar was the first distillery I visited in Scotland. Went over the very first time, many years ago.
I've still never been. I'd really love to go because I know it's Diageo's kind of like training. It's the one that they didn't modernize quite deliberately and kept open. So I suppose it's Diageo's version of an old style distillery until Brora. I don't know. I think that they keep saying they're going to turn Brora into this sort of working museum, but I haven't been yet. So that's still something on the tick list. Maybe later this year. Hopefully I'll get up there and have a look. You wouldn't have been, have you? Because you've not been to the UK since...
I haven't been to the UK since the pandemic, so I want to get up there and see Brora myself and see the new distillery. And I want to get down to Islay and see what they've done at Port Ellen and see how that's coming along.
I think Port Ellen's a bit further behind, isn't it? But then, of course, you've got Sekindra's new setup, where I keep telling him he should call it single malt, but he hasn't taken the bait yet. So maybe give it a few years. I'm sure the idea he'll come around.
They've only broken ground there. Basically, just started doing the initial groundwork at the site. They haven't even started putting steel in yet.
Yeah, I believe so.
Last update we got the other day.
It's going to be a while. They've picked a name, haven't they? Port Natruan, I think, or something like that. Yeah. So, I think it's going to be really interesting what they do. I mean, they've got a good team, and they're not going to do anything by half measures. Like, he's spent so much time and obviously money getting this site together, and I think his background is old bottles and the quality of older style whiskies, and so he definitely wants to bring that into it. And I think Georgie's a inspired choice for distillers.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it'll be really cool to see what they come up with. It'll definitely
No,
be good.
I have all the time in the world for Georgie Crawford as a distillery manager.
Oh yeah, she's
She's gonna make that place sing, so to
yeah,
speak.
Georgie's a legend. Yeah, she's cool. And I think it's a good example of like what excites me about this coming decade in whiskey is that there's so many new people coming into whiskey with, I think, much fresher and more realistic ideas about how you make quality and how you differentiate. And so I think that's going to lead to a lot more diversity and interesting stuff in um, not just Scotch whiskey. I mean, we talked before we were coming on tonight about Ireland and about America and how that's like, that is out there as far as I'm concerned in terms of a lot of uh, pretty maverick distillers in the wilderness creating amazing mad juice.
So, what else is making you happy about whiskey these days?
I like that the indie bottler scene in Scotland is pretty thriving at the moment. So I suppose when you think about Scotland and whiskey today, I think a rising tide floats many ships, and that's true for distilleries, but I think it's also true for bottlers. And I think there's a kind of new wave of bottlers like North Star, Thompson Brothers, Lady of the Glen, Watt Whiskey. There's and even these slightly older guard ones that have got new people in it, like Adelphi. And I think these people and these companies reflect. I would hope that we're in there as well. They reflect the strong personalities and character of the people behind them in the way that I think good distilleries do as well. These people have much more humorous, fun brands that reflect a bit of playfulness and not taking whiskey so seriously. Because I think Scotch whiskey for so long suffered from this idea, or suffered from an innate conservatism and perhaps quite a lack of imagination. And I think that's changing. And that I think I would say is the fundamental thing that's changing at the bedrock. And you can see that going into indie bottling companies and into distillers. I think that's really cool. The thing we say about Decadent Drinks is that we're about fun and not taking whiskey or life too seriously, because I think too many people do.
But how hard is it to get your hands on casks these days?
Yeah, it's very hard. And one of the things we've been really lucky with is we have a good relationship with Signatory. So Signatory Vintage, located at Edgewood Distillery, owned by Andrew Symington. We have a good relationship and we're able to buy some stock from them. And also we're quite, we take a broad brushstroke approach to supply. That we will buy from auctions, private individuals, brokers, so the sort of very traditional routes versus the non-traditional. And also, I think increasingly what's going to happen is that independent bottlers will have to have good working relationships with the new distilleries. So we get some casks from like Ardent American, Smogan, good new wave distillers who are producing beautiful quality and understand that indie bottlers are a part of the scene. There's some distillers have a very anti-independent bottler mentality, which I think is wrong. I think it's a bit damaging and kind of pointless, because indie bottlers are a huge part of I think people's inroads into malt whiskey, and a huge part of how people educate themselves about malt whiskey, not just malt whiskey blends and grain as well, but just whiskey in general. So I think indie bottlers have always had a strong role to play, an important role to play, and still do now. And I think the new distilleries that work with them and get that, I think that's probably a big part of the future for both. There's a symbiotic relationship there in the future for both types of company.
Graham Fraser wants to know what you see as the future for all these new craft distilleries that are producing young whiskey and bottling it at literally just 3 years and a few days in some cases.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty brutal situation for them. Obviously, I totally understand why, because because these distilleries have got bottom lines. Making whiskey from scratch, a new distillery, new brand, is so expensive, and you've got to wait so damn long. I mean, making whiskey is about literally trying to buy time, and it's so hard. So I get why so many of them have to get out at 3 years old. And I know that long term, a lot of there'll be all sorts of business plans behind the scenes that approach this problem in a different direction, different angle, looking at, okay, how can we get through how do we get from year 3 to year 10, and what do we need to do just to get ourselves there? The ones that will be successful, I think, will be ones that can demonstrate quality. There's a lot of great distillate that's showing really well at 3 years old, even if it's not 100% there yet or really perfect. There's a lot of beautiful quality being produced that I think people will be quite generous, in that, I want to get on board with this distillery from its get-go, from its journey, and follow it and see how it progresses. And I'm willing to buy into that. It's easy to sell the first bottling, but quality is what sells your second, third, fourth, and fifth bottlings. And I think people need to recognize that just making yield won't cut it. You've got to accept that.
But then
character comes with a little bit of loss of yield, I think.
But then I remember 15 so years ago, at least, people were griping with Ardbeg about the Ardbeg almost there, the Ardbeg getting really close, the Ardbeg just a little bit more now. We're almost there,
Yeah.
and that whole series of bottlings leading up to
the new 10-year-old, yeah,
the new 10-year-old, and people were complaining about that. And some of those whiskeys weren't very good, to be honest.
I think that's true. I think there was probably a bit of, I think there's a difference between a big brand, which at the time, don't forget, Ardbeg at the time was quite a bit of a new frontier in terms of what a modern cult whiskey brand could be. Ardbeg inherited quite a strong reputation amongst European hardcore whiskey geeks off the back of the indie bottler scene in the 90s. And then they had all these amazing stocks from the 70s, which they made very good use of in further enhancing that brand and its value. By the time they had young stuff that they'd made themselves around 2003, they already had a pretty strong following, and they had a very fledgling, this is still the age of innocence, they had a fledgling Ardbeg committee thing that was growing, and they thought doing well. They probably had a bit too much confidence and thought, let's do this young stuff. So they did that for discussion for the committee and got loads of good feedback, because I think that was quite a good young whiskey. And I think off the back of that, they probably thought, right, let's do this whole series. And they probably would choose to do it differently now, perhaps. But I suspect there was all sorts of decision making about stock, overconfidence, and I don't know, some of those bottlings were pretty good. I haven't tasted them for years. I remember working at Ardbeg when those were coming out, and I did 2 summers working at the distillery and had an amazing time, learned a lot. And yeah, I don't know, there was a lot of positive feedback for them at the time amongst consumers. So who knows if, they all sold. I think they probably view it historically as a success, those bottlings. But that's the example of a brand almost caught at a point between being a big commercial beast and something that's still a bit niche and a bit cult. And Ardbeg's kind of unique in itself. There's not too many whiskies or brands you can quite compare it to. But it's so true, young whiskies, it's hard. I think the way that a lot of the new craft distilleries are making whiskey tends to show better at a young age. So they're designing production process to make good young whiskey. And I think that's okay, because ultimately it's what you got to do to get to that point. I give these guys a lot of patience and a lot of breaks, because I know how hard it is. I've got a distillery project I'm trying to get off the ground, and we've been doing it for 7 years, and it's promising. We might get there, but it's when you start looking at big spreadsheets and numbers in raw infinitesimal detail, it's brutal. It's really hard, and you've got to make a lot of difficult decisions, and threading that needle of quality, quantity, and market value and integrity. It's really, really tough. So yeah, it'd be it'd be very interesting to see how these craft distilleries do. All the new guys, I think quality and the market and consumer response is what's going to sort the wheat from the chaff and dictate who's successful and who fails.
Interesting question from Chris Ratcliffe. Will we lose regional identity in whiskey as more ideas mix and transfer? We've got peated Space Ciders now. We've got unpeated Islas.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think we're
dogs
moving
and
away
cats
from that.
living together, things like that.
Yeah, I mean the whole regions thing. It's arguable as to whether it was ever of a meaning. I mean, it's something that was entrenched. I think it had some more meaning back in the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, which is when it was kind of started to be defined as this sort of cultural idea in Scotland, anyway. And I think that back then there was more distinction in terms of how things were made, and there was a lot more localism around regions and distilleries, and a lot of things like, did they have access to the railway? Was that changed, whether they were using local peat or taking coal in, and everyone had their own floor maltings, and all these things created more indigenous characteristic at distilleries, and perhaps more regional distinctiveness as a result. But I think now there's so much homogenization, and so much modernization has created a more homogenized style in modern Scottish whiskey, and also that distillery, these big companies, Diageo or Pernod, they know how to make whiskey on a very deep scientific level now in ways which enable so much control over the process, and also they've made very conscious decisions about the role that wood plays in it. And wood, this is why I think some of the distilleries which speak so much about terroir but rely on quite active wood that then kind of masks so much of what they may have nobly and and possibly successfully gone to great lengths to manifest in their distillate, but then they didn't put it into SDR casks that come from France. And you're like, well, that doesn't square with a very traditionalist, very ideological reading of the concept of terroir. So yeah, I think that we will lose this idea of regionality. Maybe less so somewhere like Islay, just one island that makes peated whiskey. That's kind of hard to stamp out. But I think what you'll start to see more of is idiosyncrasy specific to distilleries will come back. So new distilleries that are saying, well, we're going to isolate our own yeast strains, or we're using local barley. We're doing anything that we can do to add individuality and idiosyncrasy to our whiskey that makes it our own. Essentially, the business argument is to create monopolies. We want to create a mini monopoly for ourselves, and the way to do that is to build in things like localism and indigenous characteristics to our product. So you'll see more individual distillery identity getting stronger, which I think is actually much better. And in my view, I'd rather have that than strong regions, because I think that's where you'll get the best overall quality.
So I asked you earlier, what's exciting you about whiskey? What's driving you nuts?
How long have you got?
We've got all the time in the world.
Yeah.
Besides NFTs.
I don't even understand NFTs. Like I'd have to. Do you know what? I have a really sneaking suspicion in my gut that I'd get, the more I learn about them, the more angry they'll make me. So I've held off learning about them because I just know that I'll get annoyed. I saw the Ardbeg thing and I thought, well, this just looks stupid. And then I thought maybe I should write a sponge about this. And then Serge published his absolutely perfect thing on Whiskey Fun, nailing it. And I thought, yeah, I'm not going to sponge that. He knows more about it than I do. It's a much better take on it. So NFTs, I don't have the bandwidth to care. The investment thing, where this whole proliferation of total charlatans and snake oil salesmen promising the earth, thousands of % return, just chuck all your money to us. These people that are just mostly anonymous and flash in the pan, people that have just popped out of the ground all of a sudden like gophers. And, I think they're spoiling things a bit and creating damage and messing things around. And, so that annoys me. That pisses me off. I get annoyed by a lot of the online discourse. I think the wider kind of culture wars and confrontational aspects of social media increasingly find their way into whiskey. And I certainly think that the the recourse people have to conspiratorial mindsets when they're, I see comments often, and so, frequently about us as well, saying, oh, the prices for this must mean this, or oh, that sold out really quickly, therefore this. They're connecting all these dots about and please tell me again how we should be doing things. I can't tell you how much I value your input on our company that you have no knowledge of whatsoever. So seeing things from both sides, because I'm still very much a consumer and a geek for whiskey. I'm a drinker. I buy bottles. I don't really have a collection, but I hoard whiskey and I accumulate it because I love it and I spend money on it. And so I feel like I see it from that side, but I also work in it and I work reasonably diversely in it. So I feel like I have a foot in both sides and see it both ways. So when I see, this kind of increasingly quite vitriolic, confrontational conversation played out in social media, and often quite negative and sometimes quite performative, people saying, open your bottles, as if it's a sin to sit a bottle on a shelf for 20 years because you like enjoying ownership of it, and you might open it one day but you might not. And I built a career starting in the world of old and rare bottles that only exist because other people didn't open in the past, and we're able to open and enjoy them now if we so choose. So there's lots of these little angles to it, and I think that that's something I would like to see, is people just being a bit more patient, to take the time to be kind to each other, to think about things, to listen, to think things through, and to not automatically jump to, go through these mental cognitive loopholes to reach this conclusion, which is actually just, conspiratorial and not accurate. So yeah, those things piss me off. But I don't know. I try not to be super negative about whiskey, because otherwise I would lose interest in it quite rapidly. I still love it. I love the drink. I love many of the people in the industry and in the culture. And, as long as I'm still having fun, I'm still here, which means I'm still having fun. So,
Amen.
yeah.
The
As
day
long as
this stops being fun is the day I stop doing WhiskyCast.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got to occasionally step back and look at it and think, well, what's on the scales? Which way are they tipping? And if they're not, it's okay for them to tip into like, fuck it all, I'm leaving. I'm going to become a dry stone waller in Orkney or something like that. But which I do occasionally think, yeah, maybe I should just go and start a dry stone walling business. That's what I'll do. But no, most of the time it's on the scales tipping towards fun.
And as our pal Bob Wending from Maltstock puts it, relax, don't take having fun too seriously.
Well, exactly. It's very easy to get caught in these mental loopholes. Don't stop doing WhiskyCast, Mark. Yeah.
Nope, not going to stop.
Here's to that.
Not going to stop. Question from Graham Fraser. Do you think single malt wine finishes are reaching overkill levels? I mean, I think we've pretty much done just about every possible finish you could do with a wine, short of a plutonium cask finish.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for an iron brew finish, Scotland's wine.
Somebody did one as an April Fool's joke a couple of years ago.
Yeah, did they? I missed that.
No, that was a Buckfast cask finish. My bad.
Well, John Beach had a Buckfast cask finish on his bar. If you ever go to Scotland, you're Inverness, go to Fiddler's in Drumnadrochit, one of the best whiskey bars in Scotland, heartily recommended. And he had a little cask on his bar, which I think he called it Buck Farkless. It was some Glenfarclas finished in a Buckfast seasoned cask. And I mean, once you've tasted that, most other wine finishes taste very tame, I can tell you. I'm the wrong person to ask this question to, because I'm not a fan of wine finishes. I don't think wine and whiskey work well. With one caveat, I do like Sauterne and sort of sweet, gentle wines like that. I think some of those can work very well. But my view about finishing is always just quite simple, which is needs time. I'm not a fan of these flash finishes. Generally, I think occasionally they work, but a few weeks or a few months I think it's too short. I think more often than not, there's a lack of balance and a lack of integration between the two forces. Because you've got to remember, whiskey spends so long in wood, 10 years, 12 years, whatever, moving that from that environment, which is quite static, into something that's suddenly very different or very active. It's a shock to the spirit system, and it changes the profile very quickly. And I think to get balance and harmony back, it's got to spend a bit of time. So I like finishes that tend to be at least 2 years. And that to me is more getting into the territory of double maturation, which is probably what I enjoy more. And of the different sort of cask types that you can use for that, my preference is always, more traditionalist things, sherry, Madeira, not even port. I think port's a bit jarring sometimes, but certainly Sauterne or something like that. I think these work very nicely. And one thing I'm a fan of, but hardly anyone does it really, is re-racking into less active wood. So sometimes taking a whiskey which is in quite a strong active cask, maybe like sherry or say something that's been full term in like a Sauterne cask for 10 years, but then put that into refill wood that's quite light and mellow, and just let it have a more oxidative, gentle process to just round out. That's something that I wish more people did, because I think that's something that's a practice that's more common in somewhere like cognac or Armagnac. And it's one of the many things whiskey could learn from other spirits, I think.
And that's a question Mike Farley asked about. Are you doing that with your whiskeys?
Not with our own. We don't have a warehouse yet. So if I have a warehouse at some point in the future, you'll start to see us releasing more, not experimental, I would say, but just more like proactive interventionist sort of whiskies, where we've taken some cask, some stock, and deliberately done something to it. And that'll be re-racking or creating some sort of Solera blended malt product. There's all sorts of things that I would love to do, and so you'll absolutely see that in future if and when we get a bonded warehouse. But at the moment, we're a bit restricted because we're working with third-party warehouses and bottlers, so you can't always ask them to do the sorts of things you'd like to do, because the sort of things I'd like to do are not necessarily too obvious, or not like just sort of traditional finishing or re-racking. So we have to work within the parameters we have at the moment. But in future, if we get a warehouse, absolutely we'll do some stuff. And yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, I'd love to do bigger batch products, blended malts, working to flavor profiles, do interesting things on a bigger scale like that. That there's more creativity. I'm all about creativity. That's what I love to do, because when you're independent bottling, you're largely just working with finished product. So those decisions that you can make in that little space between some casks of whiskey and the bottled product as an independent bottler, that for me is where the most interesting stuff happens. So yeah, once I've got the capability to do it, definitely.
Give me your predictions. Where are we headed 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road?
I think you're going to see a bigger number of, you're already seeing, what is Scotland up to now? 144, 145 distilleries, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, and it's going to be more. Yeah, this week, 5-10 years, it's going to be more. I think the idea that there's too many, this is a popular theme at the moment. People say, another distillery. But look at how popular malt whiskey is. Blends are subject to market forces, because blends are the sort of backbone of the Scotch whiskey industry in the traditional sense, and on a massive scale. So they are subject to the sort of sways of the wider economy a bit more. But malt whiskey, you can chart malt whiskey's popularity and growth on a graph from sort of the early 70s, when you get sort of industry data like that, and it just goes up and up very steadily. And I think that is set to continue. Like, malt whiskey is quite an interesting product in that once people get into it, it's something that you can always get more into. You can always learn more about it. You can always find more of it, and you can always expand your horizons and your passions. And, unless you get too into it and you have to stop for medical reasons, then it can be a lifelong passion. And you see yourself, look around the world, how many people are gathering that passion and coming to that. The internet's proliferated knowledge about this product vastly. The upheaval we've seen in the last 10 years is really as a result of the internet, I would say. And so that proliferation of information and communication about this great product, the result of that, I think, because it takes time, it's very slow. It's not like beer or wine where you can have almost instantaneous results. It takes a long time. So the result of that that's coming, I think, is a lot more distilleries, a lot more brands, but also a lot more quality. You're still going to have oceans of pretty mediocre standard whiskey, but I think you're going to have loads more little shining diamonds of really good quality and really interesting stuff with interesting, charismatic people behind it making cool stuff. And that's true of many countries, by the way, not just Scotland. And I think perhaps you're going to see a bit more of an equalizing between Scotland and a lot of the other countries around the world in terms of not necessarily stature is maybe not the right word, but certainly everyone's interest. People are going to, as whiskey lovers, are going to pay a bit more equitable attention, I think, to different countries. But at the same time, I don't think Scotland's going to lose its edge. People keep talking about the decline of Scotland, but Scotland is Scotland. It's a unique country that has its own character and personality. I as a Scottish person, I'm not in the least bit intimidated by the rise of these Nordic countries making incredible whiskey, by the rise of all these amazing distilleries in America, Ireland. To me, it's good. We should be challenged. We should be confronted with other countries, other people making amazing quality product. And it should make us want to reassess what we're doing and try harder. And I think that's what a lot of the new generation in Scotland are about and what they're doing consciously. And I think that can only be a good thing for whiskey lovers, whiskey consumers, whiskey culture.
And you'd bottle their casks if you could, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen right through me, Mark. It's all about the casks. Yeah, no, absolutely, of course. Yeah, 100%.
You mentioned that you'd blend if you could, if you had a warehouse. And Graham Fraser wanted to know if you had any plans for a blended Scotch at some point. I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit. If you did a blended Scotch, how would you define your ideal blend?
So I suppose it's difficult because I'm not, like, my love is for malt whiskey, in that I'm very much, and that's to say I'm not against blended whiskey or against anyone that loves blended whiskey at all. But I suppose my own personal passion has always been that I fell in love with the flavor and the texture and the types of flavors you get from malt whiskey. I really would want to do blended malt whiskies. I love the idea of, a malt whiskey, 100% malted barley whiskey that takes a much different approach, a much more perhaps sort of big picture approach to creating it. And you think, all right, I want to create a unique flavor profile. How am I going to go about that? How am I going to use different malts, different for the recipe? But then what am I going to do to them? How am I going to treat them? How am I going to use wood in that approach? Just taking a step back and thinking about that process from the ground up and trying to create a product which where that thought process and that creativity and that decision making can be clearly tasted in the final product. I suppose in terms of flavor profiles, when it comes to blended malts and even old blends or good blended whiskies, I love it when you get a really well balanced and quite fruity sherry flavor. So sherry, which is perhaps more of an older style sherry character, where you don't get a lot of wood activity, but you get quite a nice flavor of really elegant, fruity, like kind of sweet cream sherry sort of flavor. And that with a little tang of peat, not a heavy amount of peat, but just a sort of background, almost like Ardmore level peat. That sort of flavor profile, I think, is pretty rare to come by. And I really love it when you get that balanced and in harmony. That to me is really like decadent, pleasurable sort of whiskey at about 46% in a tumbler glass. Lovely. That is the sort of whiskey that I would very happily pour a big dram of in a tumbler and drink with pals, or just sip away at myself with a good film or a record on or something like that.
And as Graham Fraser questions, what about single grain whiskey? I've always thought that single grain was really good when done right.
Yeah, I think grain needs age, is my view. Is that grain is such a brutal industrial thing, because the strength, it has to be rectified up to above 94%. And at that level, you're stripping so much out of it. So the DNA is so narrow. And I think it just needs, minimum 30 years in some respects, unless you've got a particularly active, very interesting, very good cask. Some of the most interesting grain I had actually was by Loch Lomond. Some of their things they've been doing where they put peated malt through a column still, so it's technically grain. I think that works really well. And some of the more traditional grains that I've had that I've really enjoyed tend to be things like really old Invergordons. I remember in the old days trying some longer aged things like Canvas, which was really elegant, really lovely. For me, when grain gets old enough in good quality, clean wood, and it starts to take on this kind of, like it goes through that foam banana phase and then comes out the other side into a kind of tropical fruit phase, that's where it gets really interesting and really sexy for me. But I appreciate, this is, this sort of character it takes years. I mean, we're talking 40 plus years, decades to create, which is why, it's the sort of product that, like, we haven't bottled any grain whiskies because I haven't come across any casks that that really excited me. I think we would do it if we come across a parcel cask that fits that kind of bill and ticks those boxes. I'd probably do a grain sponge label or something like that just to showcase them. But it's tough. It's tough to get things that you really love, and I don't want to bottle something just for the sake of bottling it because I think there's a market. For me, it has to also tick the, like, I love this personally box. I think that's really important.
Question we have for you from, and I'm just pulling it up here, from Bob Wenting, wants to know if you have an opinion on the rules about Scotch that are standing in the way of innovation. And if so, what are your opinions on the current state of Scotch whiskey policy?
Well, I would say that when it comes to the Scotch Whisky Association and the regulations, I think they're actually okay because I think creativity thrives within some restrictive parameters. I think if you just make it a bit of a free-for-all, then people become sloppy. Like most of the greatest whiskies ever made, like beautiful, world-class, all these Samaroli 98-point legendary things, the greatest whiskies ever bottled, they're all made within the Scotch Whisky Association legal parameters on production. And they exist for a reason. They exist to protect Scotch whisky and the integrity of the product, which I do support and do believe in. And we know how to make good whiskey, I suppose is what I'm saying. So within those rules, there's actually loads of stuff you can do. Mashing, fermentation, malting, wood, there's so much you can do. And most of the arguments I've read from people that want to change things, it's usually about having more freedom with different wood, which to me is lazy. It's like, no, make amazing distillate. The hardest thing to do in whiskey is make incredible distillate. That's what takes the most ingredients and the most perseverance, the most knowledge, and I think also the most willingness to sacrifice quantity for a bit more quality. Anyone can put stuff into very active wood. And, one thing I didn't agree with was that suddenly Diageo bought a big tequila distillery and they're allowed to now use ex-tequila casks. That just smacks to me of a bit of hypocrisy and a bit of, pressure, because they're the big guys. And if they want a whiskey rule about Scotch whiskey to change in their favor, 20 years ago, if someone wanted to use a tequila cask to finish a whiskey, I'm pretty sure that would not have been allowed. And so that to me stinks a bit. I think that's because go back, to the 1930s, 1920s, you can probably find evidence for all sorts of casks being used, from ex-liqueur casks, all sorts of casks that we probably don't see being used nowadays, maybe for good reason. But I'm pretty sure you would not have seen many tequila or mezcal casks in the warehouses of Scotland in those years. Anyway, so that's something I think stinks a bit, but I generally support the rules as they are. What I would like to see a bit more relaxation on perhaps is labels, because just because I occasionally do things which people deemed to have fallen foul of the whiskey regulations. And it would, I think there should
in
be
terms of
perhaps,
taste, in terms of language, or what, or both.
so one of our first bottlings, edition 7, was an unnamed Glenmorangie. It was, even the sheet said it was Glenmorangie. It was in 1985, and we can't say Glenmorangie in the label, which is fine. I don't mind, but it means we can have some fun with all the, the hints and insinuations. So I basically did the sponge in like a gimp mask with a rubber plunger stuck on his arse with a little sign that said Bumsden's bitch, because Bumsden in the sponge. And then because they have these really tall stills that are often called giraffe stills, we did a giraffe with this like really long gimp mask on and a bunch of dildos around its neck, and then we did a bunch of hens called the 16 Hens of Pain. So we did this like S&M themed label, and it was no problem. Printed, boom, on the label. Everyone loved it. Great. So I thought I'll do a sequel to that. We've got a peated Anok coming up, which is very extreme, and I thought, right, let's do like a quite extreme style of label. So we did a sort of sequel thing like that, which is kind of like a slightly S&M themed thing, and it wasn't even as extreme as that Highland Malt one we did. But I got told by the bottling hall, no, and see regulation 5.1, whatever here. And of course, you just have to like, okay, fine, go with it. But and we just change it to something completely different instead. But it was the sort of thing where I thought there would be no problem to do this. It's literally, it's not cruel. It's not going to hurt anyone to do it. It's so obviously silly and funny. But the regulations are quite tight now, saying nothing even remotely sexual and nothing that could cause offense. Even if you're trying to be humorous, think about your audience. But I think when you're doing independent bottling and you've got quite a niche audience of dyed in the wool whiskey geeks, they're going to get these in jokes. And anyway, so these sorts of things are the things that I would perhaps relax a bit, is the labeling rules and rules around even things like text sizes, that you've got to have your brand, and then single malt Scotch whiskey, they've got to be certain text sizes and different orders. And I tried to do a label recently, which I thought, I'm going to try and make this label the shittest possible label. So I thought, how can I do that? I'll draw it myself. And the feedback was, no, you can't have this label because it could be seen as appealing to children, which is how bad my art is. So, and I thought, come on, that's not fair. So that was one instance where I would definitely have changed the rules. But yeah, so that aside, that small niggle, and again, I suppose it comes back to my first comment, a bit of constriction like that forces you to be creative. And actually, I think the label we've come up with for our peated Knock Do is actually probably better than the first one. So yeah, these things force you to be creative and come up with creative solutions. And I think that's very true in production. Best whiskies ever made fit the regulations. The best whiskies of the future will all be made within those regulations, and I support that for sure. That's a very long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's a perfect way to wrap things up, because yeah, you're right. The regulations force everybody to color within the same lines, but that's what separates Rembrandt from Alvin the Chipmunk when it comes to being able to make good whiskey. And I'm mixing a whole bunch of metaphors there, but
I'd like to see whiskey. I'd like to taste whiskey made by Alvin and the Chipmunks. Definitely.
Although Tabitha, the Spirit Bomb, says there should be a limit to the number of fonts on one label. I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think that, it can get a bit too jazzy at times. The one thing I'm not too much a fan of is labels that are overloaded with kind of faux Victoriana. I think you should only be allowed 1 penny farthing per bottling. I think that's a rule to live by for sure.
And no QR codes on the labels, as far as I'm concerned. I could live without a QR code.
Yeah, they're not very romantic, are they? I even think, I even wish the HMRC would do different duty stamps. I've never been a fan of these very purple kind of, yeah. That's a shame. What are you still on your Lochnagar?
Still in my Lochnagar, and it's got it on the back label. Doesn't even have the separate sticker on there. They printed it on there.
Yeah, we're not big enough yet to do that. I've been told it's an option, but one thing at a time. I'm gonna switch to a wee taste of our new Springbank bottling, which we just got coming up.
Tell us about that one.
So it's
hard to get good independent Springbanks. Period.
Yeah, we're very lucky. These came from a private cask owner, so we're quite flexible. So if we find through our contacts, just through being reasonably well embedded in the industry, we find private cask owners, we work with them to find a solution that works for them. If they want to bottle the cask, like I think people, they like the idea of owning a cask, but they don't necessarily want to pay to get bottled and then end up with 200 plus bottles of whiskey, and not have a route to then sell them on easily, or not many people are going to drink a whole cask of whiskey by themselves. So we work with these private cask owners to find a solution that helps us and it helps them. So this was a private cask owner, had a couple of casks at Springbank, and we just recently got them bottled, and this is the first of them. It's the second, because the first one came from the same guy, which we bottled last year, the 1994, and this is a sibling cask to that, which is a 94 refill sherry hogshead, 27 years old, natural cask strength of 47%. And it's actually quite a pale color for even a refill sherry hogshead, but it's a style I love, where you just get pure Springbank distillate style, but a really nice mature age and gentle wood, where it's just become very elegant. That lovely like citrus and coastal combination you get with these 90s Springbanks at this kind of age, quite waxy, a really lovely, like, elegant thread of peat smoke. And it's a style of whiskey which I just love, because you put your nose in the glass and close your eyes, and you immediately feel that's me on the west coast of Scotland. You could be in Campbelltown, or just looking out over the Mull of Kintyre or something. And you've got that feeling. And I think that's what good whiskey does, especially good Scottish whiskey. I think it gives you a feeling. It invokes a feeling of place, and good Springbank absolutely does that brilliantly. So I'm very happy to have got it. We're lucky to get these sorts of casks, and that's what independent bottling is all about. It's a real pleasure to be able to put out something like that, for sure. So really happy with it.
One final question from Graham Fraser. What are you drinking currently that you would recommend for us to try, other than your own stuff?
Yeah. So things that I've been impressed with recently, one I always come to is Ben Nevis 10-year-old. I think as a good standard Highland malt whiskey, it's really hard to beat. Great, delicious. I think the way they've put the bottlings together is very smart. It's quite gentle in terms of the wood, so you get a lot of distillery character, which is, that's my style of whiskey. I love it when you get that. I think Talisker 10-year-old is a really hard whiskey to beat sometimes. It just ticks so many boxes. It's still a great dram. It's still really charismatic. We did a Talisker tasting for the Whiskey Show Old and Rare, and it really reminded me what an amazing distillate Talisker is, and has been consistently for decades. And even now, if I'm in a pub and there's not much option on the shelf, but they've got a Talisker 10-year-old, I'm very happy. And all the new stuff from Arden American, a lot of their bottlings have been really good. And then what else impressed me? I tried the new Tandu 18-year-old the other day. Really lovely sherry cask, an older style sherry profile, really perfectly balanced, nice strength, really harmonious, very pleasurable whiskey to drink. Thought that was great. And what else do I enjoy? I'm trying to think what I've tried recently that's like sort of quite accessible, sort of recent bottlings. What was I impressed by? Springbank 10, obviously, and Lagavulin 10, the travel retail one that was just at 43%, just simple, fresh, really easy, and yet core pure Lagavulin distillery character at its DNA. That's just tip-top bottling, I thought.
Well, let's call it a night now. We've wasted an hour of your time that you'll never get back, Angus. And,
No, I've really enjoyed it. I'm always happy to sit and blather on. Thank you for letting me warble on very long-winded answers to your questions. And thanks for everyone for watching and asking questions.
No, thank you for doing for giving us your time tonight. I know it's late over there. Thank you for doing this. Angus MacRaild, the Whisky Sponge. And we're going to call it a night. No show next week because I will be traveling and I'll be on an airplane. So I will not be able to do a show at 5 o'clock New York time next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another show. Until then, take care of yourselves and we'll see you 2 weeks from tonight. Good night, all.